Storytime with Stephanie Storey.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Storytime. My guest today, I've known for years. We met at one of those writers' conferences, and for whatever reason, we hit it off. Probably because we both have a sort of performance-y Hollywood background, which we'll get to, and we were both writing historical fiction, and so we stayed in touch for years. His newest book, however, which just came out, is coming out this month in November, is not historical fiction. It is definitely a departure, but I love it, and I'm very excited to have him here to talk about it. My guest today is Wayne Turmel, and his new book is Johnny Lycan and the Anibus Disk, which I know I just mispronounced, Wayne.
Anibus. You know what?
Anubis.
If we find somebody who speaks ancient Egyptian and wants to take us to task on it, have at it.
Okay. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. Look at you, little Miss Big Time, with a show and a theme song and everything.
Oh, yeah. The show is here in front of my bookshelf, and my theme song was a lovely gift from a lovely friend who put that together for me, and it's so nice.
It's cool. I don't have a theme song. See?
Okay. I have to start. With so first of all, I said this before we started. You look like you're at a movie junket with the big poster behind you of your brand new book, which is brilliant. We all have to be out hawking them. I'm hawking mine. We all have to do it. But this book is a departure for you, because when I met you, you were historical fiction. We bonded over the historical fiction, and now you're off in werewolf detective funny. Like, it's funny, it's werewolves, it's detectives. I saw you post somewhere that it's like as if Raymond Chandler were writing about werewolves. Yes, that's what the new book is. But please tell people at home what the new book is about and how you got off onto detective werewolves.
Oh, good Lord. Okay. In the order in which you asked the question,
or whatever.
Johnny Lycan and the Anibus Disk. It's about a young wannabe private eye security guy in Chicago who just happens to be a werewolf, and he's learning. He thinks he's the weirdest thing out there, and as he gets into this case and future cases, good Lord willing, the creek don't rise. He's going to find out that there are a lot weirder things out there than being a werewolf. Werewolves have always been my favorite movie monster out of all of them.
Why?
Okay, I'll tell you why. And there's actually a story here that makes some sense. I'm 13 years old. I'm babysitting my cousin, and this was in a little town outside Vancouver, and we used to get the TV stations from Seattle. So Friday night, we had, I don't know what they called it, chiller theater or something. And there was this horrible, corny character called the Cairo Count, because it was Cairo, K-I-R-O, out of Seattle.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I saw this movie starring Oliver Reed. It was an old Hammer film called Curse of the Werewolf. And it was about this really nice guy who has this horrible rage monster inside of him. And if there's a 13-year-old boy who doesn't feel like he's a nice guy with a horrible rage monster inside of him, I don't know who that is, right?
I think most people, I think girls feel that way too, with the hormones and the raging.
Right.
And I think that's universal.
And I just kind of went, I totally identify with this.
Earlier you said, which I was very pleased to hear, that unless there's the end of the world, which could happen at any day, any time in our lives, that there will be more of the Johnny Lycan books. So when you started writing him, did you automatically, because it feels like a series, it feels like a character that you run with for a while.
I love Johnny.
He's a werewolf and he's crazy at times, but he's weirdly, he's really lovable.
You know what's really helpful? And people say writing is a lonely business. It's actually not. Typing is a lonely business. Yes. Writing is incredibly social. I have an amazing network of people here, and you've met many of them in Las Vegas at the conference. Sin City Writers, which is kind of an offshoot of Henderson Writers, which is an offshoot of whatever. There is a core of those folks that are my beta readers and my feedback group, and they are a very young, diverse group of humans. Mm-hmm. Sexually, age-wise, everything. Right? I'm the old cishet white guy. And they love Johnny. They love him. And they keep me honest. Like whenever I write something that sounds more like me than Johnny, they
hold your feet
butt.
to the fire. That's good.
They hold my feet to the fire. They really like him. And so I'm going to assume that that's more than just they're being kind. I'm going to assume that it's true because I respect those particular voices. So they keep me honest. But yeah, I like Johnny. I think he's a really good guy. You know, he's trying really hard.
Despite the fact he's a werewolf and therefore ends up in some situations that maybe on the surface you might not think would be so great, but he's like a werewolf with a heart of gold, sort of.
Yeah, I think so. Now that doesn't mean it's not violent and scary. Right. And I had somebody refuse to review the book because there was a sex scene.
Yes.
And werewolf sex. I'm just saying.
So first go backwards maybe, because the first book I read of yours was historical fiction. It was The Count of the Sahara. How did you get off on historical fiction if you were sort of a fantasy funny werewolf guy?
Well, you know, I don't know if it's each personality has his own particular favorite brand of book. I have been, from the time I was a kid, I was bibliographically promiscuous.
Yeah.
Isn't that a lovely term?
I think it's a great way to put it. I'm going to steal it. Thanks, Wayne.
It's all yours, lady. I always kind of loved a whole bunch of different genres. And so I didn't really think it was a big deal. And when I decided to write Count of the Sahara, which was my first novel, it was because I was obsessed with that character. Yeah. I had been going through this period of my life where I was reading first-hand adventure and archaeology and African exploration stuff. Yeah. And so I came across the character of Byron de Prorock and was just fascinated by him and mildly obsessed.
He's like an Indiana Jones character to me.
Well, he is in his own head.
Yes, in his own head. Just for people at home, like that's what the book sort of it was sort of funny and adventurous, and there's a lot of anyway, so it sort of brings that to mind. Go ahead.
But I was obsessed with this character. If I had a therapist, she would probably have a field day with the fact that I'm fascinated by people who have all the talent in the world and can't get out of their own way. I choose not to go any deeper than that.
Just leave that right where it is.
I'm going to let that sit exactly where it is. But characters like that fascinate me. So the reason I wrote Count of the Sahara was I was fascinated with Byron.
Okay, so then what's the common themes? Because you're writing them all. There's a common now.
Yeah, I actually have kind of, you know, this is not the first conversation like this I've had. So I've actually had to figure out what the theme is. And I think there's a couple of things. Because I write in first person, it's very method actor. You know, it's this whole James Lipton method actor thing that gets in my head where I try to become that person. And so I think that the characters are all people who find themselves out of their depth. And they find something in themselves that maybe they didn't expect to find there. Now, in the case of Byron, he was out of his depth. And what he found out was he was out of his depth. Yeah. But if you look at Luca and certainly Johnny Lycan, Johnny has, you know, he's this not terribly well-educated 30-year-old kid who'd been working construction and collecting bookies' debts for years. And he finally decides he's going to do something with his life and then immediately goes to hell, because we all know if you want to hear God laugh, tell her your plans, right?
That's right.
But I think that the books in general are a somewhat innocent person looking at the world in a way that, I mean, humor is looking at something in a way that nobody else is looking at it. Yeah. And so I think that if you have a sense of humor, the world is a really interesting, intriguing place, and you can navigate through it, you know, by having a sense of humor.
Do you find writing in first person? Because like I was always afraid of first person for the longest time. I was terrified of it. I thought, oh my gosh, it's really difficult to do well. It's like overwhelming. I'm gonna really botch this. So I avoided it, I avoided it, and I avoided it. And my newest one that just came out this year is first person. And I thoroughly enjoyed it because I loved what you said. Really getting into the person, really just seeing the world through his eyes. I also found it easier to be funny. I mean, to sort of in first person versus third. Is that
Well,
why you
yeah, because as a person, and Raphael has a sense of humor, and he's got
Mhm.
he you got inside his head, and if you get inside somebody's head, it's easier to see the humor and the insanity, and that character looks at something and goes, "What? Really?"
right? Like the
Um,
absurdity of life is
right,
easier to
exactly,
explore. Yeah.
and so I don't know. It's funny. A lot of my stuff, even my shorts, especially my short pieces, tend to be first person. And it all comes down to that kind of method actor thing where it's easy for me to get to the emotional core if I pretend really hard that I'm that person instead of just being an observer.
Yeah, it is. It is easier to get that way. It's really interesting.
Now, it is hard to pull off. And the
It
reason
is.
first person is hard to pull off isn't getting to the core of the person, it's making the plot work
Yeah.
because everything just getting really geeky and writery about this,
Please get
everything
geeky
that
and write.
happens in the plot, the character has to know,
Yes. Yeah,
right? Everything that
you
you
can't have
see,
external
everything,
stuff. Yeah.
nothing is happening off stage, or if something is happening off stage, it's all the way off stage.
Yeah.
And the reader will find out about it when the character does.
Yeah, and the other thing I found really hard, and I thought you handled this really well in this book, is there are certain things that a character knows, but the audience might not. And so you have to find a way to appropriately explain to the audience uh, the rules of being a werewolf without sounding, like an idiot. Because do you know what I mean?
Or
Like,
worse, going into the data dump,
yes, yes,
right?
exactly.
It's the what I call the as you know conversations, where
As
you're
you
trying to
know,
fill stuff in. Well, as you know, Bill, when you're a werewolf,
that's right.
and you have to avoid those. So it is a little tricky. The nice thing about Johnny is he talks to himself, and so we get to hear him talk to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And like some of us, he's not always kind to himself.
Mm-hmm.
His self-talk is not always positive and constructive,
Mm-hmm.
but we get inside his head. And so, and just a simple example, one thing that always made me crazy about werewolf movies is the guy's walking along minding his own business and he goes, "Oh crap, it's the moon." Oh, and he turns into a wolf,
Yes.
right? With Johnny, he's got this monthly cycle where it's when the moon is strong, he's crazy, he's bouncing off the walls, he's barely keeping the rage monster under control. When it's a new moon, he's dragging and he feels lousy,
Yes.
and
It,
physically he's drained. So that at least made sense to me, right?
mm-hmm.
And so and that also helps lead to the suspense of the book because we track the phases of the moon
Yes.
as we go through the story, right? So it builds up to.
It almost reminded me, did you think about this or did I make this up? It almost reminds me of like manic depressives. They go through this like really manic phase and then they back and then they fall off. And then they go through a phase and they fall back off. Like it
Yeah,
almost had
I
that.
didn't think expressly that, but I did. There's a nurse character. I love the nurse character. If Netflix or somebody really gets smart, Yancey Butler will play Nurse Ball. But anyway, she's worked in enough emergency wards that she says, "I've seen people like you." And he goes, "No, you
No,
haven't."
you haven't. Yeah.
And she goes, "Yeah, I have. Just before the full moon, they're bouncing off the walls and they're going crazy and they're whatever. And then 2 weeks later, they're dragging."
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that thing about the full moon, emergency wards go crazy at the full moon, statistically, it's not true, right? Like they've
Right.
done studies that it's, not true that the full moon affects that stuff. But if you ask the nurses, they will tell you the level of crazy associated with those incidents.
Crazier. People are a little bit more, seem a little bit more unhinged, or are.
Right. And so that's what I took. I mean, I like the manic depressive bipolar kind of thing. I like that a bunch. I wish I was smart enough to think of it.
That's just what it reminded me of. And it was just sort of like, oh yeah, but there are those cycles that people go through, and then they fall back off and they come back around. If you started out as screenwriting, you keep referring to things that remind me of screenwriters, breaking them down. You're going to a set piece. You do tend to write visually, like you're always you're in scene a lot. Is it from a background of screenwriting?
I think that certainly helps. I mean, being a movie fan and being fascinated by the process of movies and all that stuff helps. I was talking about Yancey Butler being Nurse Ball. I cast the movie in my head as I'm writing it.
Do you?
Yeah, and I see it very cinematically.
Mm-hmm.
So that helps. I think it actually, screenwriting is a great way to look at it. Frankly, going back all the way to my stand-up days, joke writing is really where it starts.
Because it's so concise, because it's so beginning, middle, and end, because
because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You got to set it up, you got to take them on the journey, and then you got to slap them. And that's and I think that process made it logical for me, and when we talk about my screenwriting career, I had 2 options, none of them made, and left LA with my tail between my legs. So let's not assume that I know more than I do.
But wait, that's half of people who went on the screenwriting journey. It doesn't mean that you didn't go down. It's more that it's 90% of people who went on the screenwriting journey. It doesn't mean that you didn't go down that rabbit hole and learn the craft. Right. And train yourself to think that way.
Sitting there with my Sid Field book, I sat there with my little screenwriter's handbook and literally tracked every line. Oh, look, there's my inciting incident.
Right?
But that training, I think, really really paid off, because I didn't write any fiction for years.
Right.
I left LA, the wife and child insisted on eating. I left, show business left me. I ran away from the circus, is how I always describe it, and got a real job and did that for these many years. And I did a lot of writing, but it was all nonfiction writing.
Right.
And then as I was pushing 50, and I was having an argument with my daughter, who was in her barely 20 at the time. And she's like, oh, I've dropped out of school and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I have to know what I'm doing and my life is over. And, and I went, you can do anything you want. Let me prove it to you. I'm going to write a novel. Because that was the thing that had scared me.
Oh, that's sweet.
I was like, I'm going to write a novel just to prove. I mean, part of it was to save my own sanity, but a lot of it was to show to her that nowhere, if you really want to do something, just freaking do it.
Because you moved into nonfiction, you wrote a lot of nonfiction books, because you're like an HR development, like helping people, like right now you run a how to work at home, right?
Well, the Remote Leadership Institute now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll give you the very, very short version.
Okay.
When I left show business, I had to figure out what I was going to do. And again, Venn diagrams. Have to make a living with no resume. The one talent I possess is I can stand there and talk. Corporate training. Perfect. So I got into corporate training. And my specialty was presentation skills. Duh.
Yes.
And communication skills. And so that got me into the business, and I got a management job, and I was doing all this stuff. And then a few years ago, people were saying, well, presentation skills are great, Wayne, but I only talk to real people like 3 times a year. The rest of the time I'm using WebEx well, nobody was teaching people how to do that. Nobody was teaching people how to communicate effectively like this.
Oh
So
my
I went,
gosh.
"Ah."
And then the pandemic strikes and you're like, look, I'm sitting here
And-
doing it.
And so after 15 years of feeling like the guy with the sandwich board, the end is nigh and nobody's really paying attention. Now I got a new sandwich board that basically says, told you. Because we teach people how to lead teams and projects and how to work remotely. So the times have caught up with us. But the whole time of my career, I started writing little articles, got published here, published there. Somebody asked me to contribute a chapter to a book. When, like all good consultants, I found myself in the parking lot with my crap in a cardboard box going, well, I guess I work for myself now.
That's right.
I figured out that if you have a book, that makes you the guy.
Yep.
So I wrote 6 weeks to a great webinar and Meet Like You Mean It, and none of which means much to the people here unless you're desperately stuck working from home, in which case let a brother help you out.
That's right.
But so I was writing the whole time, but it was very staid, boring, serious.
Yes, but what I was going to ask is, and you're also leading corporate trainings. How did that have an impact on the way you told stories? That you was there like a clarity lesson in there, or was there another kind of writing process? Because when you write that much stuff, even if it is nonfiction, it's like me writing questions for talk shows taught me something about how to structure story, and it doesn't seem like it should. But it did. Was there something in those?
I don't think so much about story because the joke telling stuck with me.
Yes. Okay.
Right. Actually, joke telling helped me write classroom training. Right. So that was more of a thing.
Right.
But what did do it was, I crank out anywhere between 700 and 1,500 words a week every single week for blog posts and articles and things that I'm doing at work. And so I've learned how to be really productive. I can bang out 750 words in my coffee break. So when I write, I have a day job and I have a wife who insists on seeing me and a dog that needs to be walked. But the reason that I can be as productive as I am is because, I'll walk around all week writing the thing in my head and visualizing the scene and taking my notebook out to the deck and noodling. But when I sit down Saturday afternoon, I'll bang out 3,000 words, 4,000 words in a sitting.
That you feel pretty good about.
That's a pretty solid first draft. Go. But it's already been processed and I know how to stick my butt to the chair and do it.
You've done a lot of things in your life.
Yes.
You've done the Hollywood thing and the stand-up thing, and then you do the nonfiction thing, and now you're doing the noveling thing. Which one did you enjoy most in your own way? And or what do you like best about the noveling thing? Because since I'm mainly interested in the noveling thing.
Right, of course. I will tell you, and Mike will back me up on this. Stand-up comedy is the greatest drug that there is. For two reasons. You are the writer, director, producer, whatever.
Star.
Right? So you have you have total control.
Yeah.
And the feedback is instantaneous. Your dopamine receptors go insane, which is why people stay in the business too long. It's why people bomb and keep coming back, because when you get that hit, when I opened for Chicago in front of 10,000 people in Saskatoon, that kept me going for a long time.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right?
Well, and even the bomb, you get the adrenaline. Because you're bombing, like you still get a adrenaline.
So nothing beats stand-up in terms of instantaneous reward. When you write a novel, it's like writing a joke and waiting a year for the punchline.
Oh, yeah, it is. At least
because you don't know. I'm in this weird thing right now where I like Johnny. My beta readers liked him, and you were kind enough to give me a blurb for it, which I'm going to assume that you're an honest woman.
Oh, yeah. Oh no, I genuinely loved him. He is.
But I'm now in this stage where the reviews are starting to come in. right? Because we're a couple of weeks out from pub date.
Yeah.
So the reviews are starting to come in, and I'm like, and it's, but I'm so pathetic. I'm like, oh, like me, I open the email with one eye, right? But I'm starting to feel like I've got something here. I'm very proud of this book, even though it's a werewolf detective thing, which doesn't have the same cachet, by the way, as historical novelist. Let's be honest.
I don't know. Don't you think a lot of people, I mean, historical novelist sounds good, but I'm convinced werewolf detective stories, there's probably more actual readers. Don't you think?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, there's a whole lot more people for, Johnny Knoxville films than Citizen Kane. What does that really mean?
I'm not sure what that says about us, Wayne.
Something about this period in time, this particular year, does not make me feel warm and fuzzy about human beings.
I know.
So maybe I'm just overly cynical. But they each have their charm. Each of these art forms, he says, bringing it back so you can put this to a close. Each of these, that's a good guest. I'm just saying. That. But each of them have their own rewards in terms of immediate rewards. Hey, when you're 25 years old and people are giving you love every night, and women that are way out of your league are talking to you and hanging out, and people are paying your bar tab, and you're traveling places you couldn't go by yourself, and by the way, you're good at it, that's really, really hard to beat. Yeah. What's amazing is that I'm very, very lucky in that when I left show business, I found something that fed the good, normal, decent part of me, the training, helping other people side.
Yeah.
Which sustained me until I found something to keep my creative, raging beast inside me under control and give me an outlet.
The werewolf inside of you. Until you found the outlet for that.
Me, exactly. So I'm really, really lucky. And they all have their charms. And,
yes.
It's funny. I said I would never be a real writer, even though I had screenplays optioned and I was in books and I had written nonfiction. And I always said I'd never be a real writer, or I would never be able to call myself a writer until I did a novel.
Really? So that was the bar for you?
Yeah. So 4 novels in, when people say, what do you do? I'm a writer and a consultant.
Okay. But
I lead with writer now. It's taken me 59 years to get to the point where I am willing to do that.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories.